Hey, everybody, welcome back to our journey through the Bible. I want to move today from the letter to the Ephesians to Paul's letter to the Philippians. As is the case with many of our scriptural texts, as we've talked about a number of times, there's some we know and there's some we don't know about the nature and the context of this letter. It's generally accepted that unlike Ephesians, this letter was actually written by Paul himself, and he wrote it to a church that he had founded years before in Philippi. We don't know exactly when, but scholars think it was probably sometime in the late 50s or early 60s. The other contextual piece that stands out for this letter, however, is that it is another that was written from prison. The truth is that imprisonment wasn't exactly uncommon for Paul. He notes three specific imprisonments in Acts, one at Philippi when he first founded the church, another at Caesarea, and a third in Rome. Elsewhere, however, he talks of numerous imprisonments. So we don't really know how many times this occurred, except that we know that it was not uncommon in Paul's life. So we don't really know where Paul is at this time. What we know is that while in prison, Paul has received the practical and spiritual support of the Philippian church during this particular imprisonment, and that this letter is a portion of his response to that support. And it's with that in mind that I want to share a particular focus today on chapter 1, verses 12 through 18a. Paul writes, "I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers and sisters, having been made confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, dare to speak the word with greater boldness and without fear. Some proclaim Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. These proclaim Christ out of love, knowing that I have been put here for the defense of the gospel. The others proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but intending to increase my suffering and my imprisonment. What does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true. And in that I rejoice." Now, to be honest, I wish I could have a conversation with Paul about these verses. He makes a striking claim here that the motivation for the proclamation of the gospel doesn't matter. He says that some do it from love and others from selfish ambition, but that none of that matters so long as the gospel is being proclaimed. It's something of a biblical application of the old public relations adage that there's no such thing as bad coverage. Honestly, I don't buy that with the gospel. I think we can point to plenty of examples in both ancient and recent history in which the motivation for proclaiming the gospel clearly did more damage than good to the purposes of Christ. I'd love to have this one out with Paul if I could. But that said, what I really want to draw our attention to more specifically is Paul's underlying spirit that comes out in that phrasing and really in this whole situation. Remember, Paul's in prison, once again confined due to his efforts on behalf of the gospel. And so it's important to look at the way he frames all of this, and it's stated with some specificity in verse 12, where he says, "I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel." Now he goes on from there, but in these earliest chapters of the letter to the Philippians, this is the remarkable sentiment that comes out in Paul's writing. Enduring multiple imprisonments, consistently embattled, constantly dealing with adversarial voices and dysfunctions in the church, Paul has this capacity to look upon his circumstance and see the opportunity for the gospel that lies within it. This, to me, is a mindset that's worth reviewing now and then. The thing that popped into my mind as I read these words from Paul are the words from Jesus in Matthew's gospel where he says, "He who wants to be my disciple must take up his cross and follow me." As I thought of that phrase and read Paul's words, I just started asking myself, do we ever read those words of Jesus with anything but the cloud of burden looming over them? Do we ever come to that phrase with a perspective outside of the sacrifice or struggle that can come with faith? Do we ever see that passage with anything other than a negative connotation? I would argue that we really don't. It's where our minds so naturally go to see the looming negativity of those crosses that we need to bear. But I would also argue that Paul might look at it a bit differently. There's no getting around the reality that Paul picked up his cross and followed. He had to be beaten over the head in order to get there, but once he got there, Paul took it on. He picked up his cross, and probably those of numerous others, and he forged ahead in his preaching and his discipleship. What I think is astounding, however, is that he didn't simply accept that the weight he carried in those crosses was a burden. But he was willing to look at them as the opportunity that they were to be a part of the work of the gospel. Now, don't get me wrong. There's no doubt that Paul had his moments of frustration and sorrow as well. What astounds me, however, is that Paul could sit there in prison, confined, dealing with all of the things he was dealing with, and say, this is a good thing. What astounds me is that Paul could view his trials through the lens of opportunity. What astounds me is that Paul looked at that cross he had to bear and didn't see it as a burden, but as a pathway to the glory of God and the message of Jesus the Christ. I think we so quickly assume that Jesus' command to take up the cross and follow is a negative thing. Paul, I would suggest, might view it differently. And I wonder how our hearts might shift if we did the same. How often do we view the crosses we bear through the lens of looming clouds and stifling burden? How often do we view them as the very path through which God's greatest work might be done? Paul seemed to have a capacity for the latter. And I just wonder how our relationship with God might grow if we found the faith now and then to do the same. Will you join me in prayer? God of countless gifts, we are so grateful for your blessings in our everyday, your presence in our every moment. Open our eyes, God, not just to the crosses that we must bear, but to the pathways on which they lead us, the opportunities they present. Enrich our faith-filled hearts, God, that we might see all as Paul did, not forever dwelling on the burden, but ever within those things seeking the wondrous light of your love at work, even in those crosses most difficult to bear. For we pray it in his name. Amen. Again, I thank you for taking this time to be with me. I appreciate sharing these devotions with you all. I hope you'll be with us Sunday morning, either here in person or online, and I'll see you next Tuesday at noon. Have a blessed afternoon and a great weekend.